So, we didn't get to cover one of these in the last 2 weeks, but we're back. So, going to be the 27th essay of Kaepernick Publishing's series of essays on police abolition called Abolition for the People. Thanks, yeah. This one is called Dismantle, Change, Build. It's written by Dan Berger and David Stein. Go ahead and drop the link in chat. Follow along. We'll be reading it on stream. As always, these are intended to be discussion style sort of readings, so while I will be reading along, I will be commentating and providing my thoughts. If you have thoughts of your own, questions, or what have you, feel free to chime in. This is about learning. The particular section of this series of essays we're in is really in the actual how to get there. All the previous sections were in the articulating the need for abolition and kind of creating a vision of how, what it could be. And this is more the tangible, how do we get there? So, dismantle, change, build. What is and what could be the policies of abolition? From state-level coalitions to sweeping federal mandates, imagining the future means spending money in the right places. The far-reaching vision of abolition is enacted daily in political struggles over spending priorities, a key measure of whose lives matter and how. Abolitionists have picked up the torch of 20th century black labor radicals and other racial and economic justice organizers who have insisted that public budgets have moral implications. Right off the bat, I love this premise. So, in the very opening paragraph, they're getting to the heart of a concept that I think more people need to focus on, which is all of us kind of look at federal politics a lot, but there's a lot even in like local politics, which is where you can affect the most change on public budgets, with how your city decides to fund its various services and where it decides to invest in, whether it be pumping a ton of money into policing or whether it puts money into things like parks, libraries, community centers, support for their community. And there has been a growing trend of cities investing more and more of their budget into just subjugating their population rather than investing in their community. So, yeah, very strong premise. Thank you. The call to defund the police is a deeply rooted strategy that to some entered the 2020 landscape as if out of nowhere. Yet the demand has been shaped by more than 3 decades of organizing against police and prisons. It's been molded by what historian Barbara Ransby has described as movements filled with leaders, from activists like James Yaki Sales in the 1980s to Ransby's own work building the Black Radical Congress in the 1990s, to that of Eddie Ellis in the New York-based Prison Moratorium Project in the 1990s and 2000s, to the ascent of the broader movement for Black Lives, and both the ephemeral and durable formations that have sprung up over the past 6 years since the Ferguson protests gripped the world's attention. The call to defund is best understood as an effort to revoke the political and economic power of police, and of the larger criminal legal system it upholds. Indeed, before the protests against the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor popularized the demand to defund police, abolitionists around the country initiated campaigns for clemency and to decarcerate jails, prisons, and detention centers. These campaigns could be found in prisons, too. Incarcerated people have staged dozens of rebellions against institutional medical neglect in the face of a deadly pandemic, building on 10 years of labor and hunger strikes inside U.S. prisons. Yeah, so I do think that this is also a couple very important points to touch on. For a lot of people, and if I'm completely honest, myself included, these ideas did seem to appear suddenly and initially did seem extremely radical and jarring. But he's right. They do have not only decades of ideation behind them and deep thought behind what this would look like, but actually centuries. It goes back even longer than the author is alluding to. The abolitionist movement really is just building on the previous concerns that existed under chattel slavery. It's just now it's a little bit more removed from most people's awareness. And the reason that's important is a lot of people will dismiss an idea out of hand if they think it's too new and such. And it is sometimes useful to point out that no, this isn't just a harebrained concept that some, new folks who are just unhappy with police have called for. This is actually built upon a lot of academic and activist and lawyer understanding of what this could look like. It's really just a reimagining of how justice is carried out, and it focuses on justice that actually heals communities rather than just beats people down. It's focusing on finding ways to create carrots rather than just bigger and bigger sticks. It also, is worth mentioning that prisons really don't treat their populations reasonably at all in the U.S. We've covered that quite a bit, but the COVID continues to ravage prison populations, and yeah. While Republicans and Democrats may use different talking points, state spending demonstrates their shared commitment to preserving racist social control through police and prisons. Whether speaking the language of authoritarianism or professionalism, both Donald Trump and Joe Biden responded to the summer 2020 uprisings by pledging additional funding and support to police, something which has actually come true under Biden's administration. That is why abolitionist campaigns to defund the police and decarcerate prisons are so transformative. They approach legal and national budgets with necessary urgency as a venue in which the status quo can be either reinforced or remade. It is both a defensive posture and a visionary one. It's a three-pronged strategy that the abolitionist organization Critical Resistance has summarized as dismantle, change, build. Because, what we saw, was discussion about training police to shoot the leg rather than the chest. And okay, strictly speaking, on a purely like medical utilitarian perspective, that might be a bit better. But at the end of the day, we don't want cops just shooting people. Period. That shouldn't be a thing that they do, and it shouldn't be something that we have normalized to the extent we have. Abolitionists have long operated at this intersection of opposing what is and fighting for what could be. Beginning in the 1970s, several national organizations tried to stop the growing punishment regime evident in new laws and new prisons. After Black Marxist scholar and abolitionist Angela Davis was acquitted of federal charges in 1972, her defense committee transformed into a broader effort to stem the tide of criminalization. Among its priorities, the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, NAARPR, protested repressive legislation and police crimes, both of which were abetted by massive funding grants enabled through Law Enforcement Assistance Administration and the Nixon administration's open hostility to communities of color and the left. Yeah. And that was even before, like, the war on drugs rhetoric. So this has been going on for a while. It keeps reshaping whatever the current issue is to expand police more and more, and to expand what is defined as criminality more and more. So, yeah. And yeah, the solution traditionally has always just been throw more money at police. Whether it be train them more or get them better equipment or what have you. It's always just more police and nothing else. Despite the fact that we have the data that says that investing in communities is an actual effective way of reducing criminal behavior. The NAARPR was one of the several national coalitions to contest this increasingly repressive turn under the Nixon administration. The National Moratorium on Prison Construction gathered faith-based and secular progressives to challenge the federal government's plan to construct additional prisons in the 1970s. One of the most colorful efforts in this era, the Stop the Olympic Prison campaign, worked to block turning the 1980 Olympic Village living quarters for athletes into a prison. The U.S. Olympic Committee sued Stop for its poster, which featured the Olympic rings locked in a cage. The judge sided with NMPC on First Amendment grounds, though the prison was ultimately built. So, this part kind of bothers me and makes me sad. In the 1970s, this was when faith-based organizations actually did tend to lean more progressive. It's hard to imagine now with the state of the evangelical movement in America. But at the time, this was before Fox News, this was before Reagan really pushed people in a certain direction. It was, during the civil rights era, and yeah, there were a lot of groups that were shitty, but there was at least some degree of like Christian organizations that actually took Christian teaching more seriously, insofar as wanting to love all people as people. It's something which has eroded since then quite severely. These and similar campaigns sought not only to stop new construction, but to support currently incarcerated people who continued to publish newspapers, form labor unions, support defense campaigns, and otherwise organize against their captivity. And while they could not stop the onslaught of repression that sacrificed millions of people to police and prisons, groups like the Southern Coalition on Jails and Prisons and the Committee to End the Marion Lockdown, formed in the 1970s and 80s, helped seed new abolitionist efforts in the 90s and 2000s that began to have greater success. Here's the poster that it mentioned, Stop the Olympic Prison. Exactly, Jane. Yeah, a fair bit before they were mobilized as a base for G.W. Bush. I really do think that especially the organizing of the very deliberate organizing of right-wing media in the aftermath of the Nixon administration and leading into the Reagan administration took American evangelicals in a very dangerous direction. There was a very strange partnering with some certain faith leaders, and while it was, initially resisted, somehow we've seen a huge portion of the white evangelical crowd fall into this rabbit hole of unreality detached from the rest of us. I do wonder sometimes if that's part of the disconnect that the older generation has in not being able to recognize how far they've slid. There's still kind of a rosy-tinted opinion of the Christian right, because they used to do it, at least a significant portion of them used to actually champion positive and progressive causes. Because that's in line with, Christian teaching. But, yeah. I don't know. It might be I'm musing over that because it might be kind of a frog in a slowly heated pond sort of thing. Being steeped in it. They might have been unaware of the slow shift. Let's see. California is instructive. From 1980 to 2000, the state witnessed a nearly 500% rise in its prison population, complete with a 2-decade prison building spree that saw 23 new prisons open. At its height, the California prison system held 160,000 people, well over the entire country's prison population in 1970. To stem that tide, organizations and coalitions like Critical Resistance, California Prison Moratorium Project, California Coalition for Women Prisoners, Justice Now, Californians United for a Responsible Budget, and the Prison Activist Resource Center thwarted plans to open additional facilities in the state. More recently, these and other organizations have stopped jail expansion and pressured the governor to grant several large-scale clemencies. Together, these and other organizations comprising Californians United for a Responsible Budget have helped ensure that more than 140,000 new prison and jail beds were never built. As a result of this organizing, including the emergency clemency campaigns in response to the pandemic, the state's prison population has dropped below 100,000 people for the first time in 30 years. There's a lot to unpack there that isn't exactly being explicitly stated, but I do want to explicitly state it. First and foremost, and this cannot be said enough, if you have prisons and prison beds, under our current model, there is an incentive to find prisoners. Okay? That is to say, if you have a big fuck-off prison and it houses 5,000 prisoners, your job as a warden of that prison is not to rehabilitate the prisoners and, work with them and get them released. It's to fill 5,000 beds. That way you can, year after year, justify your budget. You can keep a full staff. You can ask for more equipment. You can talk about how, overworked everyone is. If your prison drops below and is underfilled, there's going to be questions about, do we close this down? And you can't have that. You can't allow your job to be on the line. This again is a situation where I am not saying that, they're in a room like plotting this. It's not like, mustache twirling machinations. This is just, these are the incentives that it creates in people. And whoever gets those jobs, they will follow the incentives that are laid out for them, even if that is not what they initially set out to do. So if they had 140,000 more prison and jail beds in California, they would inevitably have 140,000 more long-term prisoners. They would just find them. They would find ways to criminalize a wider net of people to fill those beds because the money demands it. And just as the calls that originated just as the situation originated to create these calls for all these hundreds of thousands of new prison and jail beds, once those were filled, the prison industry would be saying, oh, we're oversaturated, our prisons are overfull, all over again, and there would be renewed calls for more jail beds. There is no end to this cycle under this model, because the way prisons are budgeted creates incentive for ever-expanding prisons. That has to be understood. It is not explicitly stated here, but that has to be understood. On the inverse of that, if you take that concept in the opposite direction, if you abolish prisons as we see and conceive of them today, if you have no cells like that, then your incentive, by necessity, is to find ways to actually reduce criminal behavior. Because you can't just put people in a box. You can't just put people in a cage. There's no cages around to put people in. So you have to actually solve the problem. Right? That's where we want to get. Is we want to take all of those, and these things are expensive. Prisons are fucking expensive. Millions and millions and tens of millions of dollars go into building these things. Not to mention maintaining and staffing them. So putting all of that money instead into building the community, that's where we want to get. The last 6 months of upheaval and crackdown prompts the question of the last half-century and earlier. What type of protest movements could be built if communities were freed from the violence of policing and incarceration? Contests over budget priorities are about what the state can be and should be. Many abolitionists root this work in Webb Dubois' classic analysis of abolition democracy. The political struggle led by formerly enslaved people in the wake of the Civil War to construct new institutions while also eradicating violent ones. A similar fight is underway today, where currently and formerly incarcerated people and their allies work to change the world by abolishing the prison industrial complex. Scholar-activist Ruth Wilson Gilmore has similarly stressed that abolition is a theory of change. It's a theory of social life. It's about making things. Yeah. Abolition is and has always been a slate of affirmative demands for the world we need. The struggles to defund the police and decarcerate prisons are wholly intertwined with other efforts to transform society. Medicare for all, a job guarantee, and a homes guarantee are battles for a humane and ecologically just budget, as are efforts to release aging people in prison and close detention centers. Yeah. So this is the thing. If you look at all of the money being spent on over-policing, on prisons, and on maintaining prison populations, if you took all of that budget, you could implement these things. Housing security for every person in this country. Period. You could actually ensure health care, medical and mental health care for everyone in this country. No questions asked. And yeah, you could certainly expand jobs programs. And hey Ray, how's it going? But instead, budgets are consumed by an infinitely increasing demand for bigger and more prisons, and for the staff to create criminals out of people to fill those cells. The Green New Deal is or could be an abolitionist project. The Red New Deal certainly is. If you haven't read about the Red New Deal, you should look it up sometime. I'm not going to get into it right now, but I may do a segment on it later. While many of those policy goals can only be fully achieved at the federal level, that spirit animates local and state battles, which is where most spending on police and prisons take place. Yeah, this is also why I bang on about local politics so much. Yes, it would be great to just be able to have this mandated from on high. That is very unrealistic. However, you can affect change at your city and county levels a lot more easily. They can start carving back on their own local police spending, up to and including abolishing their own police department and instead focusing on investing in their community. These goals that we have been talking about for weeks, for months, are achievable entirely at the local level. And if enough localities implement these things, and the data shows that it actually creates a healthier community, as every place that has scaled back their police does show, we might see it rolled out at the state and federal levels eventually. But a lot of that means organizing and educating your local community to warm them up to these sorts of ideas and to get people in office who are sympathetic to these sorts of ideas. How are you doing, Epolate? I didn't see you sneak in. Let's see. For example, while federal spending on prisons accounts for about 10% of all prison spending, only the federal government can thoroughly cushion against economic recessions and depressions. But with the jackboots of local police off the necks of activists across the country, movements against austerity will have greater chances to flourish. Combating inequality will still be an uphill climb, particularly as municipalities try to co-opt or dilute abolitionist demands. By reducing the number of police in prisons, by eliminating the state's capacity for repression, the defund struggles work to enlarge broader movement capacity. Abolitionists remain resolute on the larger goal of freedom. Let's see. You snuck in when I went live? Oh. Thank you. I'm doing all right. Now, let me punch this up too. Epolite is a variety streamer who you should follow, and recently got their channel back after it was banned by Twitch as a result of being hate rated, which really dropped the ball on that one. So yeah. Let's see. From the civil rights movement to Occupy Wall Street, criminalization has been a key tactic to undermine protest and roll back the welfare state. Neoliberal austerity was imposed via a police officer's pistol in the bars of prison cells. In response, abolitionists pursue what anthropologist Hannah Apple has called reparative public goods, like housing, education, and healthcare for all. Entering the realm of public policy, abolition rejects the political obstinacy and technocratic fixes that have seen major cities actually increase their funding for police departments this year, and most states continue to use conviction status to deny voting rights to most currently and formerly incarcerated people. According to the Sentencing Project, 1 out of every 44 adults, that's over 2%, is disenfranchised by the carceral system, just one of many ways that policing and imprisonment constrain political participation. This is a particularly insidious aspect, too. denying people the right to vote if they have been, incarcerated, because it makes it even more difficult to get public support in opposition of police and prisons. Because what it means is the only people who are voting are people who have not had to interact with the prison system or have had minimal interaction with it. They're not in a good position to analyze what the prison system is like and to meaningfully vote on policy surrounding that system. It is that 1 out of every 44 adults who is best informed on what the prison system is doing to its population. Police and prisons uphold the world that is. Abolition fights for the world that should be. Abolition unites struggles across time and space. Okay. I'm gonna just delete that. What that comment's all about. I can figure. Oh, I don't know how, but there we go. Abolition unites struggles across time and space. Abolitionist causes like ending cash bail, which is just, there are so many problems with it. Incarcerating and closing prisons, freeing elderly and vulnerable incarcerated people, providing humanitarian aid to migrants, decriminalizing sex work, halting evictions, supporting incarcerated survivors of domestic violence, blocking deportations, expanding healthcare. These reforms have revolutionary implications, which is why they've been resisted so bitterly. Bye. I'm just gonna ban that person. Okay, there we go. When united together, they form a comprehensive agenda. It is a platform to eliminate austerity and create what Ruth Wilson Gilmore and sociologist Paul Gilroy have discussed as a universal future for humanity. These practices are both the abolitionist horizon and its route. Yeah. So yeah, some of the books Dan Berger's written. Dan Berger teaches at the University of Washington, Bothell, coordinates the Washington Prison History Project, wrote Captive Nation Black Prison Organizing in the Civil Rights Era, and co-edited Remaking Radicalism, a grassroots documentary reader of the United States. David Stein is UC President's Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of African American Studies at UC. His book, Fearing Inflation, Inflating Fears, The Civil Rights Struggle for Full Employment, and the Rise of the Carceral State, is forthcoming. So yeah, that was Dismantle, Change, Build. It, it speaks in broad strokes of the kind of specific policies that are being advocated for, as well as touch loosely on a blueprint on how to get there, especially through local politics and community change. And it also highlights the fact that when pushing for these changes, even though the data shows that this increases the health of communities and lowers criminality, these changes will be bitterly fought against. And the reason why is always the same. The police state exists to perpetuate the police state. It will always seek to expand its power and expand its budget. The incentives are set up for it to do that forever. It doesn't matter how large a percent of the population is behind bars, it will always want more behind bars. There's money in it. So yeah. Hopefully, folks got something out of that. We'll be continuing on the next essay next week. Let's go ahead and shift over here.